On a crisp autumn morning, a gentle breeze carried golden leaves across the pathway in front of the small house where Mr. Huang and Mrs. Dung had lived for over 30 years. The weathered, gray-tiled roof had silently witnessed countless moments of joy and sorrow shared by the elderly couple. As the sun cast its final weak rays of the day, the house exuded a sense of peace, yet beneath that tranquility lay an unspoken grief. No one could have predicted that this day would mark Mr. Huang's last in this world. News of his passing quickly spread throughout the village, leaving everyone in shock. How could a strong, careful, and composed man like him suddenly depart due to something as simple as a fall down the stairs? Neighbors flocked to the house, each harboring questions they dared not voice. Inside the main hall, incense smoke curled in the air, mingling with the deep, solemn fragrance of burning sandalwood, enveloping the space in mourning. The rhythmic chanting of the monk resonated in the quiet atmosphere, occasionally interrupted by muffled sobs from Mrs. Dung and grieving family members. Her face was pale, her eyes swollen and red from countless sleepless nights. Seated beside her husband's casket, her trembling fingers gently traced the framed photograph resting atop the wooden lid. In a quiet corner of the room, little Ngoc Long, Mr. Huang's 3-year-old granddaughter, huddled beside her mother's legs. Wearing a white mourning headband, her innocent eyes reflected pure confusion, unable to grasp the gravity of the situation. She glanced at her grandmother, then suddenly asked in her clear, childlike voice, "Grandma, why did you push Grandpa down the stairs the other day?" Her innocent question sliced through the heavy silence like a sharp blade. The chanting ceased, the weeping stopped. The entire room fell into a stunned hush as every pair of eyes turned in shock toward Mrs. Dung. Mrs. Dung collapsed into the chair, her hands trembling as they clung to its edge. Her face turned ashen as if she had just awakened from a nightmare. With unsteady fingers, she reached for a handkerchief to wipe away her tears, but the gesture failed to conceal her distress. Her voice wavered as she mumbled an incoherent response, avoiding the piercing gazes of those around her. Soft whispers began to ripple through the room. Children never lie. Could there be something more to this? How could a strong man like Huang simply fall down the stairs? The initial sympathy toward Mrs. Dung gradually morphed into suspicion. The once warm atmosphere now felt cold and heavy, as if an invisible weight pressed upon everyone's chest. Every whispered remark, though spoken in hushed tones, cut through her like a blade. She lowered her head, caught between the grief of losing her husband and the suffocating guilt that had begun to creep into her heart. Outside the window, the evening sun had faded, replaced by a thin veil of mist that draped over the house. The rustling of fallen leaves blended with the quiet sighs filling the room. The air was thick, not just with sorrow, but with the looming presence of an unspoken truth, slowly weaving its way through each glance and breath. Min, the only son of Mr. Huang and Mrs. Dung, had always been a devoted son. Throughout his life, he took great pride in his family, a small yet warm household where he had been raised with love and strong moral values. To Min, his parents were the foundation of his world. His father, a quiet yet responsible man, had exemplified patience and sacrifice. His mother, gentle and nurturing, had always been his pillar of support through difficult times. But now the peace he once held dear was beginning to crumble. A creeping sense of doubt had started to cast its shadow over everything he had believed in. From the moment little Ngoc Lan, Min's young daughter, innocently spoke at Mr. Hong's funeral, nothing seemed the same anymore. Her pure yet razor-sharp words had left a deep wound in Min's heart, cutting into fears and uncertainties he had never dared to face. In the days following the funeral, Min found himself unable to sleep. Night after night, he searched through his memories, desperately trying to find a logical explanation to dismiss the thoughts creeping into his mind. But the more he tried, the more he noticed the strange changes in his mother. Mrs. Dung was no longer the calm, gentle woman he had always loved and respected. Instead, she flinched whenever someone mentioned Mr. Huang's death. The warmth that once filled her eyes had faded, replaced by an evasive, unsettled gaze. On several occasions, Min caught her sitting alone, her expression empty, her hands gripping the hem of her dress as if struggling to suppress something deep within. The unease within Min grew stronger by the day. He began questioning his father's death. How could a strong, careful, and composed man like Mr. Huang die so suddenly from a simple fall down the stairs? The more he thought about it, the less it seemed like an accident. Determined to uncover the truth, Min sought out Mrs. Mai, their elderly neighbor who lived just next door. She was known for her keen awareness of everything happening in the neighborhood, always observing with quiet attentiveness. Sitting in her small house, Min tried to appear calm, but his hands clenched tightly on his knees, his heart pounding in his chest. Then, in a hushed voice, as if afraid someone might overhear, Mrs. Mai began to speak. "That night, they had a terrible argument," she murmured. "Mr. Huang was yelling, louder than I've ever heard before. Then there was the sound of things crashing, breaking, and a moment later, Mrs. Dung ran outside, calling for help, saying he had fallen down the stairs. At the time, I didn't think much of it. I just assumed it was an accident. Min sat frozen in place. Mrs. Mai's words struck him like heavy blows, hammering into his mind. His parents had never been the type to argue. In all the years he had lived with them, he could barely recall a single moment where they raised their voices at each other, even over the smallest matters. But that night, what could have driven them to such a heated dispute? What had made his father shout so furiously to the point that furniture was overturned? And after everything, why did this so-called accident leave Min with such an overwhelming sense of unease? As he stepped out of Mrs. May's house, his legs felt as if they were weighed down by lead. He walked through the dimming twilight, his eyes fixed on the home where he had grown up, a place that had once been his sanctuary. But now, that warmth had faded, replaced by an invisible darkness, a terrifying secret he could no longer ignore. Upon entering the house, Min stopped before his father's portrait. Mr. Huang's face bore a gentle smile, his eyes filled with the same warmth Min had always known. But now, Min could no longer find comfort in that gaze. Instead, all he could see was sorrow, a silent plea, an unanswered question lingering from beyond the grave. He sank to his knees, his hands trembling as he lit an incense stick for his father. As the delicate tendrils of smoke curled into the air, Min made a silent vow to Mr. Huang. I will uncover the truth, no matter how painful it may be. He knew the path ahead would be filled with obstacles, riddled with thorns, but he couldn't turn back now. He wasn't just searching for answers for himself. It wasn't just about seeking justice for his father, the man who had loved and sacrificed everything for this family. Min lay on his bed, staring up at the ceiling. Each second passed in the silent night, stretching endlessly. The cold wind slipped through the window cracks, carrying the rustling whispers of leaves, eerie and haunting. A storm of emotion swirled inside him, the pain of losing his father, the doubts about his mother, and an inexplicable sense of anxiety. Min didn't want to believe what he was sensing, yet every sign, every word, and every glance from his mother since his father's passing felt like sharp daggers piercing his heart, a heart that had always trusted her unconditionally. Memories of his father flooded back. Mr. Huang, a quiet but steadfast man who had loved his wife and children with all his heart. Min remembered the times his father painstakingly repaired their old bicycle just to take him to school. The evenings he sat by the dim oil lamp grading papers to help Min's mother when she was still an elementary school teacher. His father had always been that kind of man, a symbol of resilience and love. How could someone like him meet such a cruel and unjust fate? Unable to endure the weight of his thoughts any longer, Min sprang out of bed. In the cold, hollow silence of the house, his feet instinctively led him to his father's altar, as if guided by an unseen force. He gazed at his father's portrait. Those gentle eyes still seemed to be watching over him. But now, they no longer held the peace he once knew. In the stillness of the image, it felt as if his father was trying to say something urgent that Min had yet to understand. He began tidying up the altar. As he picked up his father's old notebook, a strange feeling stirred within him. This notebook had always been Mr. Huang's most treasured possession, where he meticulously recorded everything related to his work and life. Min carefully opened it, flipping through the pages. At first, the entries remained familiar. Lists of daily tasks his father had always noted with precision. But as he turned toward the later pages, the handwriting grew shaky, rushed, as if written in a state of deep distress and unease. Then Min stopped. His eyes froze on a brief but haunting line, each word screaming an urgent plea. Dong, don't make me lose face in front of our children. Don't let things go too far. Min's heart nearly stopped. He sat in silence, trying to decipher the meaning behind those words. Lose face in front of our children? What had his father meant? Let things go too far? What things? His grip tightened around the notebook, an unshakable fear rising within him. His gaze suddenly landed on his father's old phone, the only thing his mother, Dung, had left on the altar as a final keepsake. A thought flashed through his mind. Perhaps the answers lay there. He grabbed the phone, plugged it in, and waited, his breath caught in his throat, every second stretched unbearably, as if time itself were pulling his nerves taut. Finally, when the screen lit up, Min swiftly opened the message inbox. Most of the texts were mundane conversations with friends and neighbors, but one final message, sent to his mother just before his father passed away, made Min's blood run cold. Dung, I know everything. Don't force me to do something I'll regret. Min read the message over and over, afraid he might be misunderstanding its meaning. The words in the message, coupled with the notebook's cryptic entry, felt like scattered pieces of a puzzle, one that was slowly coming together, revealing a chilling truth. But the picture unfolding before Min was not one of clarity and light. It was dark, filled with pain and torment. His father had known something, but what? What was it that he had called something bad? Min's hands trembled as he set the phone down on the table. He looked up at his father's portrait. His eyes in the photograph now seemed heavier, as if peering deep into Min's soul. A crushing weight settled on his chest. His breath grew shallow and his heart clenched with an unnameable sorrow. Slowly, he sat down and lit an incense stick for his father. The thin trail of smoke curled upward, dissolving into the still air. But to Min, it felt like a fragile thread linking him to his father. Bowing his head, he whispered a silent prayer. Father, if there is anything left unresolved, please guide me. I cannot let you leave with unanswered questions or buried truths. The candle flickered, its wavering light casting shifting shadows on Min's face. He lifted his head, determination burning in his gaze. He knew the truth was out there, waiting to be uncovered. And no matter how treacherous the path ahead, he could not turn back. This wasn't just about finding answers for himself. It was about protecting his father's honor and preserving what little remained of their family's dignity. The next morning, mist still clung to the winding village roads. Min stood silently by the window, watching his mother's figure as she stepped out of the gate. Mrs. Dung wore a thin coat, a scarf wrapped tightly around her neck. Her eyes darted around cautiously, as if ensuring no one was watching. That wariness sent a fresh wave of unease through Min. He didn't know where his mother was going, but a strong instinct told him he had to follow. Without hesitation, he stepped out, keeping a careful distance so as not to be noticed. His gaze locked onto the small, retreating figure of Mrs. Dung. Shrouded in the mist, Mrs. Dung's frail shoulders hunched slightly, as if weighed down by an invisible burden. Min's heart pounded in his chest, not just from the tension of following her, but from the storm of unanswered questions raging inside him. The mother he had once revered and trusted unconditionally was now at the center of his growing suspicions. A realization that cut him deeper than he could bear. She stopped in front of a small cafe, tucked away behind a dense cluster of bamboo, an isolated place, far from prying eyes. Min hid behind a large tree, his gaze locked onto her every movement. She stepped inside, choosing a secluded table, one that was out of sight from the entrance. Moments later, a middle-aged man arrived. He carried himself with a rigid composure, yet his eyes gleamed with a calculating sharpness. A chill ran down Min's spine as the man sat across from his mother. Moving cautiously, Min inched closer, seeking a vantage point where he could both observe and overhear. Their voices were low, but the words that reached his ears cut like a blade. "You need to stay calm," the man said, his voice deep and firm. "It's done. Don't let anything slip." Min saw his mother shudder slightly. She lowered her head, her fingers intertwining tightly as if grasping for control. When she finally spoke, her voice was strained, barely above a whisper. "I can't take this anymore. Gaklan has been hinting at things in front of others. I'm afraid Min is starting to suspect something. The way he's been looking at me these past few days, I can't even meet my own son's eyes." The man narrowed his gaze, his brow furrowing slightly, irritated by her fear. Lowering his voice, he spoke with an icy finality. "No one knows a thing. I've taken care of everything. All you need to do is stay silent. Min or anyone else will never uncover the truth." Those words struck Min like a heavy hammer, making his heart pound erratically while his blood seemed to freeze in his veins. "Handled everything cleanly." The phrase echoed in his mind, ringing like a death knell. Everything was becoming painfully clear, even though he desperately wanted to deny it. He stood still, staring at his mother. She lifted her gaze slightly, her eyes filled with anguish and fear. Her voice was barely above a whisper, yet each word resonated clearly in his ears. "But I can't sleep. Every night I dream of him standing in the house looking at me with accusing eyes. I'm terrified." The man let out a sigh, his tone laced with disdain. "That's just your guilt eating away at you. There are no ghosts. He's dead, and no one will ever know what really happened. If you keep acting like this, people will start suspecting you." Mrs. Dung buried her face in her hands, her shoulders trembling. But then she slowly lifted her head, her eyes wild with panic. "But Min, what if he finds out? He's my son. I won't be able to face him if the truth comes out." The man smirked, his smile cold and mocking. "And what if he does? Just deny everything. Without evidence, no one can touch us. Do you understand?" Min couldn't listen anymore. His entire body felt paralyzed, yet inside a storm of rage and pain surged violently. Who was this man? And why was his mother entangled with him? The words he had just heard shattered everything he believed in. Darkness clouded his mind, each sentence cutting into him like a blade, carving deep wounds that would never heal. Silently, he stumbled away from the cafe, his footsteps unsteady on the desolate village road. The icy wind lashed at his face, but it did nothing to dispel the emptiness gnawing away at every fiber of his being. Min wondered if he had the strength to face the truth that was slowly unraveling. But there was one thing he was certain of. No matter how cruel the truth might be, it had to come to light, and no matter the cost, he had to uncover it. That night, the house was shrouded in darkness, with only the dim glow of the desk lamp casting light on his father's altar. Min sat in the living room, his eyes bloodshot from hours of tension. His hands trembled as he gripped his father's old phone, the small notebook, and the painful fragments of truth he had pieced together. Everything was now painfully clear, but even even so, he needed to hear it from his mother. Mrs. Dung stepped into the room, her face gaunt and exhausted. Min looked up, his gaze cold yet filled with anguish. He slammed the phone and notebook onto the table, his voice hoarse but firm. Mother, I know everything. Did you and Mr. Long kill my father? The question shattered the silence in the room. Mrs. Dung froze, her hands falling limp at her sides. Her face turned pale, her eyes wide with terror. For a moment, she stood motionless, as if paralyzed by the weight of the accusation. Tell me, Mother. Min's voice rose, trembling with both fury and unbearable pain. Did you do it? Did you and Mr. Long kill my father? Mrs. Dung instinctively took a step back, tears streaming down her face. She tried to speak, but the words lodged in her throat. A silence stretched between them, heavy and suffocating, as if time itself had frozen. And then she collapsed onto the chair, her shoulders quivering. Yes, her voice was so faint it almost disappeared into the air. I was wrong. I made a terrible mistake. Min sat motionless, his eyes widening in shock. He couldn't believe the words that had just left her lips. Mrs. Dung, the mother Min once deeply respected, the one who had always taught him to live with integrity, was now the very person who had played a role in his father's death. She lowered her head, tears streaming down her face. Her voice was hoarse, as if each word drained the last remnants of her strength. That day, your father found out about me and Mr. Long. He was furious. He said he would tell you and everyone. I begged him not to, but he wouldn't listen. We argued, he struggled with me, and then she choked on her words, hands covering her face, her sobs breaking through. Mr. Long, he rushed forward, and your father slipped and fell down the stairs. It all happened too fast. I couldn't stop it. I didn't mean for this to happen. I just wanted to keep everything peaceful, but I was wrong. Min, I was so wrong. Mrs. Dung collapsed to her knees before Min, her hands clutching the floor, tears falling uncontrollably. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I never wanted your father to die like this. I never wanted things to turn out this way. Min sat frozen, his eyes staring blankly into the distance. The pain within him swelled like raging waves, drowning every last emotion he had left. He couldn't speak, couldn't cry, couldn't even feel anger. All that remained inside him was a hollow emptiness. What am I supposed to do now, Mother? His voice was barely above a whisper, echoing from the depths of a darkness he could not escape. Father didn't deserve to die this way. He was a good man, the person I respected the most. Why? Why did it have to come to this? Mrs. Dung lifted her head, her eyes pleading desperately. I know I was wrong, but please don't hate me. I didn't mean for this to happen. I just wanted to protect our family, but I was wrong. I was terribly wrong. Min looked at his mother, his eyes red and filled with an indescribable pain. But in Min's eyes now, the warmth of a son's love for his mother was gone. He stood up, silently walking out. The door closed softly behind him, leaving Mrs. Dung slumped on the floor, her shoulders shaking with agonizing sobs. Outside, the rain poured down. Min stood beneath the freezing downpour, the wind lashing against him, soaking his clothes. But he didn't feel the cold. His heart had already frozen over, trapped in an unbearable storm of pain and conflict. He looked up at the darkened sky, rain mixing with the tears streaming down his face. Father, Min whispered, his voice breaking under the weight of his sorrow. What am I supposed to do? I can't forgive her, but I can't hate her either. How do I move past this? The sky offered no answer. Only the rain continued to fall, as if it too was mourning, a silent lament for a family shattered beyond repair. After that night, sleep never came. Min lay awake, restless. The house, once warm and full of life, now felt hollow and cold, as if it too could sense the collapse of everything it had once sheltered. He sat in the darkness, his bloodshot eyes staring out the window, where the pale moonlight filtered through the leaves, casting restless shadows. Like the tangled thoughts tormenting his mind, two images kept clashing in his head, locked in an endless, irreconcilable battle. On one side was the mother he had always known, the gentle woman who had held his hand on the way to school, who had stayed up all night by his bedside when he was sick, who had taught him how to live with kindness. On the other side was the harsh truth he had just uncovered, the same mother, the one who had, directly or indirectly, played a role in his father's death. The pain in Min's heart was unbearable, each beat threatening to shatter him completely. Min looked up at the altar, where his father's portrait remained, his gaze in the photo still watching over him, gentle yet weighed down by sorrow. He stepped forward, placing a trembling hand on the frame, his heart tightening. Father, he whispered, his voice shaking, what should I do? Mother was wrong, but she is the one who gave birth to me. How can I turn her over to the law? But if I don't, how can I face you? How can I live with my own conscience? The thin tendrils of incense smoke curled upward, carrying Min's unanswered questions into the air. Deep down, he already knew the answer. But to say it out loud, to act upon it, Min understood it would be the most painful decision of his life. Morning broke, faint rays of sunlight slipping through the gaps in the wooden shutters, marking the start of a new day. But for Min, this was no ordinary day. He had made his choice. Even as his heart screamed in protest, even as his love for his mother pulled him back, Min knew he could not ignore the truth. He gathered every piece of evidence. His father's old phone with the final messages, the notebook filled with trembling handwriting, and the words he had overheard in that fateful conversation between his mother and Mr. Long. Each item he picked up felt like a knife slicing into his soul. But Min knew if he wanted to give his father the justice he deserved, this was the only thing he could do. When the police arrived, the house was eerily silent. Mrs. Dung sat on the living room chair, dark circles under her eyes from countless sleepless nights. She did not cry, nor did she resist. Her face bore exhaustion, but also a quiet acceptance. Min stood in the corner of the room, his gaze fixed on his mother, his heart clenched in unbearable pain. Seeing his mother's frail shoulders, her small, weakened frame weighed down by time and unforgivable mistakes, Min felt a deep ache in his chest. Just before stepping out of the house with the police, Mrs. Dung turned back, her eyes filled with remorse, yet also overflowing with an undeniable love. Her voice, though trembling, remained firm. "I know I have done something unforgivable, but my child, I love you. No matter how wrong I was, you are everything to me. I only wish for you to live well. Don't let hatred consume your life." Min stood frozen, unable to speak. Tears streamed down his face, but his feet would not move. His hands could not reach out. All he could do was watch as his mother's small figure disappeared behind the police car door. The vehicle slowly pulled away, taking her further and further from him. Min stood in the courtyard, silently watching until the car vanished from sight. His heart felt as though it had shattered, yet at the same time a strange sense of relief washed over him. He knew he had done the right thing, no matter how much it hurt. Rain began to fall, droplets collecting on the ground, but Min did not feel the cold. He lifted his gaze to the gray sky, as if the rain itself was soothing the wounds in his heart, little by little. "Father," he whispered, "I did what you wanted. I did the right thing. But now, how do I go on?" The sky offered no reply. Only the wind whispered past, carrying the lingering scent of incense from his father's altar. Min stood there, letting the rain soak through him, feeling like a leaf drifting in the current, unsteady, yet searching for a new direction. And in the deepest depths of his pain, he felt a faint, fragile glimmer of light. It was his father's message, his mother's eternal love, and the hope of a future where he could rise again, overcome everything, and rebuild his life from the fragments. That night, Min drifted off to sleep on the chair beside his father's altar. The room was shrouded in darkness, with only the faint glow of the oil lamp casting shadows on his weary face. Outside, the rhythmic patter of raindrops blended with the whispering wind rustling through the trees, composing a melancholic symphony that seeped into every corner of the house. Min sat there, his heart weighed down, his mind entangled in unanswered questions. In his dazed state, he found himself lost in a vast field. The sky stretched endlessly above, clear and blue without a single cloud. A gentle breeze swept through, carrying the scent of ripe rice, wild grass, and damp earth after the rain. The serenity was so profound that it left him in awe. He gazed toward the horizon where the golden sunlight bathed everything in a warm glow. And then he saw a figure approaching. It was his father, Huang. He wore the familiar white shirt, his posture strong yet exuding an effortless grace, as if he belonged to the very essence of this field. His face remained unchanged, kind, gentle, just as Min remembered from childhood. When his father would hold his hand and walk him along the village paths, memories and dreams flooded Min's mind, rendering him motionless. His legs felt frozen in place. He wanted to rush forward and embrace his father, but his body refused to move, as though he was standing on the fragile boundary between reality and a dream. Tears streamed down his cheeks as he choked out, "Father." Huang stepped closer, resting a hand on Min's shoulder. His eyes were filled with love and boundless compassion. His father's smile was as gentle as a passing breeze, free of blame or sorrow. He looked straight into Min's eyes, his deep, soothing voice resonating like a balm for the wounds in his heart. "Min, I do not blame your mother. Everyone makes mistakes, and she has already paid the price for hers. Do not let hatred steal the peace from your heart." Min froze, his lips trembling. He shook his head, his voice hoarse. "But father, what she did is unforgivable. I love her, but every time I think about it, the pain is unbearable. I can't breathe. What should I do to move past this?" Huang's smile remained unchanged. His hand gently squeezed Min's shoulder as if trying to pass on warmth and strength. My son, hatred will only weigh you down. I am gone, but you still have family, you still have Ngoklan, and there are people who need you. Live well, for me, for our family, and most importantly, for yourself. Min collapsed to his knees, tears streaming down his face. He reached out to touch his father, but his hands met only empty air. Father, I'm sorry. I couldn't protect you. I feel so powerless. Hwang slowly shook his head, his eyes filled with boundless compassion. He leaned down and spoke softly. Min, you don't have to carry this burden forever. Your life is still ahead of you. Don't let the past hold you back. I have always believed in you, and I will always be here, by your side. His figure gradually faded, merging with the golden light of the fields. Min reached out desperately, but only his father's voice remained, echoing through the vast space. Be strong, Min. I have always been proud of you. Min jolted awake. The room was still shrouded in darkness, but for the first time, a sense of peace settled in his heart. His father's words still echoed in his mind, like a small flame illuminating the deepest shadows of his soul. Min looked up at the altar, his eyes brimming with tears. Slowly, he rose to his feet and carefully lit an incense stick for his father. As the delicate smoke curled upward, he whispered, Father, I understand now. I will live well, take care of our family, and make you proud. I will not let hatred control me anymore. I promise. Outside, the sky began to brighten. The first rays of sunlight filtered through the leaves, casting a golden glow over the courtyard. Min gazed at the sky after the rain, crystal clear as if his soul had been cleansed. He knew the road ahead would not be easy, but he was ready to move forward, no matter the pain. He believed he could endure because his father's love and the hope he left behind would always be a guiding light in his life. That morning, the sky was vast and unblemished, a pure shade of blue. The gentle sunlight bathed the endless fields, illuminating the narrow path leading to the cemetery. The ground was still damp from the night's rain, glistening under the soft morning light. Min walked slowly, his steps heavy, his arms clutching a bouquet of white chrysanthemums. Their fragile, pristine petals mirrored the sincerity of his devotion, an offering to the man he loved and respected most in the world. With each step, memories surfaced, playing like an old film in his mind. He remembered how, as a child, his father would lead him across these very guilds, telling him stories of life and dreams. Hwang, a steadfast, quiet man full of love, had devoted his entire life to protecting his family. But now Min walked alone along this familiar path, carrying a grief too deep to fill. When he arrived, he stood in silent reverence before the grave. The simple headstone, surrounded by lush green grass, blended seamlessly into the tranquil beauty of the field. Min knelt down, gently placing the bouquet of white chrysanthemums on the cold stone. His eyes lingered on the inscription engraved on the tombstone, Home, a beloved husband and father. With trembling hands, Min reached out, tracing the letters as if, through them, he could touch his father's presence one last time. Bowing his head, he spoke softly, yet his words echoed in the stillness of the cemetery. Father, I came here to tell you, I'm sorry. I couldn't protect you. I let our family fall apart in pain and sorrow. But I promise, I will live better. I will live as you taught me. I will take care of Ngoklam, protect what remains of our family. I will not let hatred control me because I know that's not what you would have wanted. His voice faltered, his throat tightening. He lowered his head even further, his tears falling silently, merging with the earth beneath him. A gentle breeze swept past, carrying the subtle scent of grass and wildflowers from the distant fields, like a tender touch from his father, comforting him. Min looked up, his eyes still heavy with grief, yet now holding a glimmer of determination. Suddenly, an inexplicable feeling surged within him, an overwhelming sense that his father was there, watching over him from somewhere beyond. He closed his eyes, and in the absolute stillness of the fields, he heard his father's voice, warm and gentle, just as he remembered. Min, you did the right thing. I do not blame you, nor do I blame your mother. Everyone makes mistakes, and she has already paid the price. Let go of the hatred, for it will only weigh down your heart. Live well, my son, for our family, for Ngoklan, and most importantly, for yourself. I have always believed in you. Those words felt like light piercing through the darkness that had long burdened Min's soul, easing the weight he had carried for so long. Min opened his eyes, clasped his hands together, and whispered, Father, I promise, I will make you proud. I will no longer let pain and hatred control my life. I will live well because I know that is what you would have wanted. He stood up, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon. The sky today was crystal clear, and the golden sunlight bathed the vast fields, making everything shine more brilliantly than ever. A gentle breeze carried the melodies of birds singing from the trees in the distance, blending into a symphony of life. The road ahead remained long, but Min walked forward, feeling lighter than he ever had before. He knew that, though challenges might still await him, he was no longer alone. His father's love, the faith he had in him, and the hope he left behind would always be the guiding light leading him through life's storms. Each step Min took was a declaration that he would live, that he would love, and that he would honor his promise to his father. He would lead a life worthy of pride, not just for himself, but for his father, for his family, and for the values his father had cherished and upheld throughout his life. Dear valued audience, we are deeply grateful that you took the time to listen to this story. Through every word shared, we hope not only to bring you moments of meaning, but also to touch your hearts, inspiring reflection on the values of love, forgiveness, and faith in life, even in the darkest of times. This story serves as a reminder that no matter how turbulent life may be, love and hope will always be the guiding light that helps us overcome hardships. Sometimes forgiveness is not just for others, it is also the path to finding peace within ourselves. If this story resonated with you, we would truly appreciate your support. A simple like, a comment, or a subscription to our channel would be a tremendous encouragement, allowing us to continue spreading the beauty of life's value. Your kindness and support mean the world to us. Thank you sincerely, and we wish you and your loved ones peace and happiness always.